Good afternoon and welcome to Cold Chain Insights, the podcast that focuses everything temperature controlled logistics of the pharmaceutical industry. My name's Thomas Hunt, and this week I'm delighted to be joined by Frank Binden, who was previously the Global Head of Supply Chain Management and Vice President at Santen, and prior to that was Head of International Supply Chain Executive Director at Celgene. More recently has been running his own consultancy practice and business in the space. Frank, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you, Thomas. I'm fine, thanks.
Good. I think a good place to start would maybe if you give a overview about the history in your career in this space, and then maybe a little bit about the current consulting work that you're doing.
Right. So I've been in the pharma supply chain space for quite some time. Most recently, leading the global supply chain of a Japanese pharma company. Before that, leading the international supply chain of a US biopharma company. So I've been through quite some contrasts there, also culturally. And I started out as an industrial chemist at one of the big Swiss pharmaceutical companies. I also worked at the other big Swiss pharma. So I've done also a lot of supply chain related roles in those two companies, and also worked as a consultant for a big consulting firm in the meantime. Right now, I'm working on supporting pharma companies who want to take their supply chain global or optimize their global supply chain, but also with service providers for the pharma company who want to optimize their offering, restructure their offering from a customer perspective.
Yeah. Okay, nice. And recently, I want to start around, you've been putting out some really interesting clips on social media, on LinkedIn, in terms of quite a regular series of things that you're doing, which has been some great content. And I know you've just come back from China. I was quite interested to understand in simple terms, what did you see that most of us are missing right now when you were there?
Yeah, I think there is some big misunderstanding that many people still have. It's coming from the past, basically. They say, oh yeah, China is good at copying and China is good at doing cheap, high volume stuff. And this is not what I'm seeing anymore. At least my two recent visits, very clearly, it's not the case anymore. There's a lot of innovation, and there's also high quality of that innovation in the biopharma R&D, in robotics, in electric vehicles, whatever you want in terms of modern technology. China is absolutely leading, and it's an original leadership with high quality. So that has to be understood. Otherwise, we're completely underestimating China.
Yeah. And when you were there, what were the sort of big innovations that you saw for our space? What are the things that really you took away from that trip that really stuck?
Yeah, I think it's the sheer amount of drugs being discovered and developed in China. I think it's now about 30% of all drugs that are in the pipeline, in the discovery pipeline, are originating in China, and this drives, I think, some major changes in the pharma industry.
Okay, interesting. And long term, I know you expect Chinese firms to commercialize globally under their own brands, which completely makes sense. What do you think are going to be the effects of this, and when do you think it will happen?
Yeah, I think it's not something for the next 2 years, but I know quite a couple of companies are on the go, already are active in Europe and in the US. They have brought products to the market and are now building up their own organization. So I think we'll, on the horizon of 5 years from now, we will see full-fledged pharma multinationals originating and headquartered in China. And I think this will be quite a big change. So there will be a reshuffling of roles. And I think, all the technical abilities that people in the West have to offer still remain very relevant. What will also become very important is the capabilities of working productively together from both sides, from the Western side as well as from the Chinese side. Okay.
Do you think it will be a positive change, or are there sort of concerns that you have with it in terms of its rollouts?
No, I think for me it's positive. That means there's more drugs that will reach the patients, so that is always positive. But also it's a good opportunity for us to rethink ourselves, to rethink what value can we deliver and how can we work across cultures. And I think it's, for me, my personal experience is that it's extremely interesting and enriching to work with China. So I think it's positive.
Yeah, and do you think the industry sees that? Do you think there's perceptions out there in terms of people's understanding of the Chinese market and what it has to offer, or do you think there's still a learning there?
There's still a learning for sure, but I'm convinced as this progresses, and I have colleagues who have joined Chinese companies and doing well. So it's going to develop. I'm not concerned about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good. Right now, as I understand, many Chinese companies are out licensing early. And if you ran supply or cold chain as a US or EU buyer, what 3 checks do you do before you sign? What should people be thinking about?
Yeah. I think as part of a due diligence, you have to understand how does the manufacturing network look today, and is that manufacturing network capable of covering the commercial phase demands or not? And if not, what is then the next step? So you need to see that there is a path forward, that you're not somewhere stuck in a dead end, because there is just a clinical supply that will be completely insufficient, and no plans at all to scale that up to the commercial. That's one thing. Mm-hmm. And then you want to understand what is the complexity of the supply chain. So you need to understand what kind of modality are we talking about. Are we talking about autologous in vitro cell and gene, which means a highly complex individualized supply chain, or is it something where you can have more the classical batch manufacturing style? And then you need to understand how risky and how cumbersome is it going to be. So what's the stability data? What temperature range does this indicate for transport and storage? And what's the shelf life, or the expected shelf life at least? So then you know how difficult will the supply chain be to run.
Yeah. Okay. And what are the sort of issues that you see with people having to run that or implement that as a scenario?
Yeah, I mean, you need to have, on one hand, you have to have people who are present. You can't do that all just via Zoom calls. So you need to have a good mix of presence, and also you need to understand where are the partners, because mm-hmm. you're not going to run the temperature controlled supply chain on your own. You need to have capable partners, and then you already at that stage you need to think about who could be the partners I could entrust this shipments and so on with.
Yeah. Okay. And I know you're obviously very strong on sort of risk and resilience, and I've seen that you argue that most shocks are not surprises, which I do agree with. And if I map a network or I was mapping a network in the real world for risk, what's the first few fixes I can make within 60 days? What would you recommend?
I think the quickest and also normally the least expensive is to look whether you have the alternate shipping routes that you need. So what you should do is sit together with your forwarders and look at what are the lanes, what are the roads, freight, air freight, sea freight lanes, and then you could overlay that with there's publicly available risk maps. There is quite a number of institutions that look at geopolitical risks. You can also find in the public space, open intelligence, you can find risk maps for earthquakes and stuff like that. And if you overlay these risk maps on your lane network, then you'll understand which are the shipping lanes where you probably should have some alternative up and running. For example, mm-hmm. Are you going through the Red Sea? Okay, if what are alternative shipping routes? And I think working with your forwarder or forwarders is probably a very efficient way to handle that, because these people by profession, they have a good understanding of mm-hmm. these risks. And in any case, I would start with the shipping routes, because that's the part of your network that you can influence and improve the fastest.
Yeah. And how reliant are you? Would you recommend people are on their forwarder versus their own team doing that work? How much are each side sort of contributing?
It depends a bit on the size of your company. If you're more in a startup mode, you just can't afford having maybe somebody more or less dedicated to this kind of risks, but you still need somebody who can have a productive discussion with your forwarders. So in any case, you should have on your team somebody who comes out of that profession and really is able to have educated discussions with them. But I think a lot of that could of course be really given to the forwarder to risk assess. But then you are dependent, and maybe in your risk assessments you want to have a bit more independence. So it makes sense for you to have within your organization somebody who looks into these factors.
And where do you see the biggest risks at the moment in terms of what the market's saying, what the customers' feedback is? Is it sort of geopolitical, or is it heat or weather or other factors? Where do you see the most common risks coming from?
I think at the moment it's geopolitical. If you look at things like a Red Sea, basically a Suez Canal closure, purely geopolitical. Of course, we had the Panama Canal congestion, which was really a weather event. We shouldn't underestimate the impact of climate changes on global shipping routes. But I still think that the geopolitical risks are currently on top of everybody's mind.
Yeah, and you've been in the industry for a long time, and you've experienced many different markets and fluctuations. In terms of how difficult it is to ship pharma today versus maybe 10 or 15 years ago, do you think we're in a much more challenging position now than we were, or what's your perception of that?
No, I think we are today. It's from a partnership with the forwarders, with the shipping lines, with the airlines. It's easier. And also from a perspective of having tools available, tools for monitoring and real-time data transmission and visibility, that has definitely improved. Overall, I think the world overall has become more complicated, that's for sure. But in the industry, I can see has been such a development on all sides. Technology for packaging, for example, technology for monitoring, for real-time data transmission. That has improved a lot. So I find it easier today as somebody coming from pharma to have good and meaningful discussions with forwarders and packaging companies and so on.
Yeah. No, okay, that's interesting. Do you expect that additional factors will influence the supply chain network design going forward? And if so, which ones?
Well, I think the first and foremost, government interference. And it sounds negative, but in fact, I think it's something normal. The governments are where the power is. We have forgotten about that for quite some time. But the governments have the power. They have the power on the territory. They set the rules, and they have interests. So I would say fair enough if they say, well, we are maybe not quite happy with some things happening in the pharmaceutical industry. We think it's important. We want our country to have a bigger share of that. That's all very natural. And what we can see is, on one hand, there are incentives where countries try to bring more pharma manufacturing to their shores. Mm-hmm. There's also some more coercive measures and saying, hey, you know what, if you don't manufacture here, we might slap a tariff on your products. It's all fair game. I think we shouldn't be shocked about that. What I think is underestimated is the pricing, the in-market pricing, where we had for a long time, it was Europe, South Korea, Japan, and so on, where governments were really exerting tight control on prices, pressure on price, tough assessments for new drug and the price of those. And the US was more or less where you could freely price your products, and this is changing. Again, here, this is fair game. Why should the US pay a higher burden of pharmaceutical innovation than other countries? So that's all understandable. But this is changing, and this will also, the pricing change will change the strategies for product launches and will change how the supply chains will look like.
Okay. And where do you think that's quite interesting what you've just said there. Where do you think we'll be in 2 or 3 years' time around that piece?
Yeah, I think the US is definitely going forward with that most favored nation pricing. And we have heard from big pharma CEOs, I think notably from Pfizer and from Novartis CEOs, who said, hey, we expect others, notably Europeans, to rack up prices, because otherwise we might be in a situation where we delay launches into European markets, or we don't launch in European markets at all. So I think there are really deep changes to the whole commercial logic also in new product introductions that are coming up.
Right, okay. And when do you expect the increased risk and uncertainty levels to go back to pre-2020 levels, when obviously there was such a shift and a seismic event for the whole sector?
Going back to that level, well, I guess not in my lifetime, which I hope to be still quite a long time. So no, it's not imminent. I don't see any path that would bring us back to the stability that we had for decades. I think that is gone. So, and we have to live with a higher uncertainty.
Yeah. And is that an uncertainty of another pandemic, or is that geopolitical? Or is it, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, another pandemic could well happen. I mean, there's bird flu that has infected a lot of the cattle herds in the US, and so it has gone from birds to cattle, and then from cattle to human. It's probably well, I'm not a microbiologist, but I imagine that's maybe not such a big step. So there could be at some point there will be a new pandemic, but I think it's more the geopolitical environment that has changed, with where we see more fragmentation. And consequently, I can also imagine that supply chains will fragment.
Yeah. And if you're advising a client on how to manage their supply chains in the new climate, and say if we take geopolitical as the main one, what are the main things that you're trying to dive into in that first 6 to 8 months with them to help them sort of improve what they've got, or which areas do you look to focus on?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand where are the risks. Are the risks due to, well, your drug being manufactured in a region that would not suit your primary markets? There is of course, as I said, the potential pricing incentive in the US for local manufacturing. There's also the US Biosecure Act, which could be used to block products that have been developed with input from certain Chinese companies, to say that way, block them from certain segments of the market. So that has to be understood. And then the de-risking would go, I think, to a big extent, to see where can dual sourcing be implemented. Where does it make sense? Because it's really expensive. And if you do dual sourcing, you really have then to use both manufacturing, both supply sources. So this is a big change to the supply chain, raises the costs. It's potentially big investment. So that has to be thought through. Which are the drugs for whom we want to do this kind of de-risking? So there's prioritization necessary.
Yeah. Okay, good. I sort of know that you've, and I heard around a lot of the mode switches that you've done in your career, and switching various medicines to different forms of transport obviously is important. And you flip lanes from ocean to air and back and forth. And you mentioned the Red Sea routes there, which obviously you're involved with. One rule for switching mode in temperature-controlled medicines that you tend to follow. What's your experience there?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I would try to not switch modes if I can. So if I have a sea freight route, then we have chosen sea freight for reasons, combination of volume and transportation requirement and so on. So first, the first question is, okay, do we have an alternative sea freight route? But then if that sea freight route is so much longer that we run into supply issues, which is what you can typically encounter, then that's the moment where you have to switch to air. That's definitely the case. If you see the new route is going to take 2 to 3 weeks longer and also has a bigger uncertainty, and you might not be able with the inventory that you currently have that was based on your old previous setup, you might run into issues, and there I would rather switch early than wait for issues to develop.
Yeah. During that Red Sea route, when you had that major issue there, where were you working when that happened? And can you give us the story about what unfolded and how you managed it?
I mean, there were some shipments from Europe to Korea that we in the end had to reroute to air freight, because it was really critical for a production change we were doing, and we really didn't have inventory of that product in that variant that would have tided us over a couple of additional weeks. So in the end, the decision was to switch to air freight, even though it was a shipment that was uncomfortably big. We had to even split it, I think, in the end across 2 flights. But it would have been too risky or really asking for trouble to switch to another sea route.
Okay. And to make that switch from air to ocean, what must be ready in your mind before you press go?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, you would have prepared the alternate route. So you would have lane risk assessment, you would have everything prepared with your forwarder, potentially SOPs and so on. And even better if you were once in a while using that route, maybe one out of 10 shipments, you would be using the alternative route just to make sure everything works. But if you're in a pinch and you need to activate an alternative route without having all that together, what I would at the very minimum want to see is to have a lane risk assessment ready and approved, because that lane risk assessment should then tell you, you know what, with the current transport packaging and monitoring and so on, you can go on that alternate route without endangering the product.
Yeah.
But that, for me, that would be the absolute minimum. Depending on who it is, my QA colleague would maybe ask for more, but I think for myself, this is what I would want to see. What's the lane risk assessment?
And those risk assessments are obviously pre-done in advance. Would you recommend people do that across all lanes anyway, so it's extremely quick?
I would. I think this is kind of a minimum preparedness. And as said, this is not very costly if you compare that to building 6 months of strategic inventory, or if you compare that to investing $200 million into a new facility. Doing some lane risk assessments, sitting together with your forwarder and preparing alternative shipping routes, that's nothing. And it's quickly done, and you can do that for your supply chain.
Yeah. So there's no panic when something crops up.
Exactly.
You already know the process. Yeah. Okay. And if you wanted to sort of reduce risk on a lane tomorrow, or in its most frictionless way, where would you start? What is the start point for that process?
I think packaging is something that should be reviewed regularly, because there's a lot of progress in that area. And what you have evaluated maybe 3 years ago as the best solution, there might be something better. If you have a lane where you say, oh, this is a bit, we are still not completely comfortable with the risk here, look at packaging. That's what I would do in the first place.
Partners and data. I wanted to go on to that. I know it's something that you've covered in some detail. What real-time info from a contract manufacturer do you actually use? And what just tends to be noise in the industry? Because I think we've had a lot of guests on here who talk about the amount of information and data that's produced now for them in their senior roles can be almost inhibitive sometimes.
Yeah, I think when I look at contract manufacturers, they are so important. I mean, a pharma company who outsources their manufacturing, the product is everything in the end. And you want to be sure of the quality and the effectiveness of that product. So a contract manufacturer is very important. And I don't think we could have too many data coming from that. If you have set up an electronic connection, and there is data that don't interest you, you will not get to see that at a senior level. It would be easy to filter it out. Having said that, I believe everything that has to do with expected time of release, with expected timing of shipment, with expecting timing of arrival, that's hugely important. Advanced shipping notifications are hugely important. But my position is I would always like to see more from the contract manufacturers, more data. I would like to see what status is a production order in. Has it already been dispensed? Has it already been manufactured? Has it already been packaged? That gives me more confidence that the timing will be okay. But I think everything that has to do with timing, that's my primary interest in that sense.
Okay. And what would be your advice for someone sort of going into sort of outsourcing into contract manufacturing in terms of building that really seamless partnership with a manufacturer? What are the steps that you would advise a client to take?
I think you have the best would be to have a set of the data that you need in a way that is as standardized as possible. And there are industries, you have to adhere to industry standards. There are even tools or networks that offer you, well, basically you have a lot of manufacturers already connected to that network, and you can use that network to establish the link with your manufacturer, which means limited additional effort on both sides. But I think in any case, the important is to standardize it and to establish a clear understanding on both sides what the data actually mean. The worst would be that you have data that goes under the same label, but both sides have a different understanding of. Then if you have that, then you're in real trouble.
Yeah. And how do you make data stick across sites in terms of vendors, etc.? How do you make sure that data is used correctly and is being absorbed in the right sort of teams? Yeah,
I think also that a lot you have to do the preparation and you have to do the standardization. And if you are working with an existing network, that's where I think you have the biggest gains, because adding another manufacturer will be relatively effortless. But in any case, I think standardization, and you can't come to your contract manufacturer and say, I want this kind of data that nobody of your other pharmaceutical clients is asking for, but I want it because I have a very special process. And people will look at you and say, explain to me, why is your process so special? And the reality is in most cases, there is not a good reason. It's more like ingrained or maybe legacy stuff. And I think we need to be ready to standardize our own and challenge our own processes.
Yeah. And what would be the typical reasons that relationship would break down or would be set up in the wrong way? Where do people go wrong when they're setting up that contract manufacturing piece?
Expectations, differing expectations or wrong expectations. I have seen cases where contract manufacturers were brought on board based on, and they got high-level forecasts of high growth, but it turned out, unfortunately, that these were the forecasts overall for the client company. But the products that were in scope for that contract manufacturer had a much lesser growth. So there were some kind of wrong expectations on both sides. That is a huge risk. And the other thing is insufficient understanding of technical requirements and capabilities. So really you need to bring the experts together and work out things in detail to make sure it fits.
Yeah. Okay. Just going on to some event pieces. I know you've spoken about and debated about Black Swan events at a number of industry conferences. Over the last, say, 5 or 6 years, what's changed in your playbook to deal with those sort of events?
Yeah, I think much more reliance on, open source intelligence. Basically, there's so many information sources available. There are logistics industry newsletters, or institutions that do geopolitical risk assessments and publish. Of course, they sell specialized in-depth report for a lot of money, but typically they publish high-level takeaways freely, so that's available. You just have to read it, and you have to make sure your team gets it and ingests it, and then using that for a more proactive risk assessment. And I think that makes a big difference already.
Right. Okay. And I also saw that you joined a DEI discussion in Lyon. What hiring or team habit made your supply chain, cold chain work faster and safer that you could share?
I think diversity is really important in the sense that I want to have teams where there are people that are different from me in their experience and in their way of thinking. So, for example, what is really beneficial is if you have people who maybe culturally are much better able to deal with improvisation than a Swiss or a German would, which is more my background. So if you have somebody, let's say, it's all, of course, at that level, it's cliches and you have to go to the individual. But people, let's say, from Greece or from Philippines would be much more comfortable with improvising things and would be able, in a situation where everything seems to break down, they could probably reconnect the dots more quickly than somebody like me. And so I think it's important to have different backgrounds and different personalities in the team. And that's something I've always tried to do. And I think it makes the team much stronger.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. Just a quick fire round, just to sort of come into the end here, Frank. So I wanted to ask, can you share a risk you think most companies are quietly ignoring right now?
Well, right now, if there is a major military escalation in the Middle East, I think we would be in a bad shape for shipping, sea and air, also for traveling, because this is really the region that now connects Europe with Asia. And if you see how much airspace is already blocked for European airlines and for Russian airlines, for reasons that we all know, if you add to that maybe the airspace over Iran and the whole Gulf and so on would be blocked, I think then we would be in major trouble. The same as with the Strait of Hormuz, and this is something that could happen short term. Of course, I can't make any statement on how probable this is, but it's certainly possible.
Yeah, that's a great point. And how much pressure does that put on the supply chain? What would be the reroute at that point?
Yeah, I think sea freight is probably easier, but I think air freight could get into real trouble. You would certainly need to rely on airlines, much more on Asian airlines that do not have the restrictions that European airlines have to cross the Russian airspace. For sea freight, I think you would have to go routes much farther around the Middle East, which would add a lot of extra mileage.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, good. Thanks. Ocean, air, or rail? What do we underuse for temperature sensitive products, and why?
Well, I think rail. I mean, ocean and air are by now quite well understood when it makes sense and when it makes less sense. Rail, I think, is more intriguing. I think we can do more with rail freight in the pharmaceutical industry, generally speaking. And of course, that means temperature controlled transportation as well. And I think that has to be looked into much more detail. I know there's some companies doing some pioneering work, but as an industry, I think we should.
I agree. Well, do you know, have you any feel why rail isn't used more for temperature sensitive transportation? Because I haven't seen it used particularly often, as you say.
One of the perceptions of rail freight has been, you can't get a reliable schedule the way you get with air freight or with sea freight. I think this is changing to some extent, but it's more something that hasn't been used and needs to be discovered. I think we need to establish more understanding, more knowledge on those.
Yeah. Okay. If you could change one thing about how the industry thinks about cold chain, what would it be?
Well, I think we should think of cold chain and temperature controlled supply chain in general as a competitive advantage much more. We shouldn't think of it as something that we have to do it and let's just go away with the least cost. I think we have to really see how can we make most use of it, how can we gain competitive advantage with it. So I think it's a shift of mindset of seeing this is a good thing. It's a good thing that we have cold chain, and we have to see how can we gain even more value out of it.
Yeah. Okay, good. If people want to get in contact with you, Frank, and sort of discuss your consultancy work and other bits, what's the best way of doing that?
Well, yeah, on one hand, LinkedIn. There's also a link to my website there. So I have a website for my consulting activities at gsca.swiss. And there you find a lot. But already, if you go on LinkedIn and just get in touch with me, I think we can take it from there.
Brilliant. Frank, thank you so much for coming on. We've covered a massive amount there, and you've got a huge amount of knowledge in the space. So I really appreciate your time, and I hope you enjoyed the session.
Thank you, Thomas. It was very pleasant.
Pleasure. So you've been listening to Cold Chain Insights. My name's Thomas Hunt. Please tune in next week for our next guest. We look forward to seeing you then.